I am Nathaniel Stinnett, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And today I am really excited to walk you through some of our voter file analysis of what we call environmental drop-off voters in 8 battleground states. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. There we go. All right. And the way that this session, the way that the next 55 minutes is going to go is, first, I'm going to give a very quick reminder of EVP's work. For those of you who are already familiar with the Environmental Voter Project, don't worry, I mean it. This will just be really quick. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Environmental Voter Project, please understand that this session is not meant to be a general introduction to every aspect of our work. This is a briefing webinar going over a lot of voter data. So I will very quickly go over what we do, why we do it, and how we do it. But please just understand that it will only be very quickly. As we go through, Shannon and Ren will provide you links so that you can get more details on our work if you're interested in that. Then we're going to dive into the real meat of the discussion today, and that is our in-depth voter file analysis of these environmental drop-off voters, which I'll define for you later, but very briefly, these are super environmentalists who vote in presidential elections, but pretty much nothing else. Third, we'll go through opportunities for you to get involved, ways to help us find these drop-off voting environmentalists, and more importantly, mobilize them so that they vote this year and continue to vote afterwards. And then hopefully we will have a very robust Q&A session. And again, if you're interested in asking a question, please, rather than putting it in the chat section, put it in the Q&A session, and we'll either be able to answer it in real time online, or I will answer it when we get to the Q&A session. So without further ado, let's jump into part one here, quick reminder of EVP's work. So we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that is just laser focused on finding environmentalists who don't vote and then turning them into better voters. That's it. That's all we do. We identify environmentalists who don't vote and then we turn them into better voters. And so as many of you know, that also means we don't do a lot of the stuff that your typical environmental nonprofits do. For instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. As odd as it might sound, we don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate or the environment. A good way to think of us is we're not in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business. Instead, we are solely in the behavior-changing business. We find already dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. They just need their behavior changed. And that's what we do. We take a 3-step process. First, identification. And again, forgive me for not going into a lot of details here, but I want to get to the briefing, which is the real reason you're here. Using data analytics, we build what's called predictive models. And what these models allow us to do is assign individualized scores from 0 to 100 to every single voter in the voter file. And these scores don't just tell us who are the people who have the highest likelihood of caring about the environment or caring about climate change. No, it's much more intense and in-depth than that. We're identifying people who care so deeply about climate or the environment that it's quite literally their #1 priority over all other issues. This is an extraordinarily precise technique. Then, though, what that allows us to do is message to these super environmentalists as individuals and bypass the hardest, most expensive part of politics, which is issue education and changing people's minds and changing their opinions. We don't have to do any of that. These are people who, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. They are dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists. They don't need persuasion messaging. They need a behavioral intervention. They need behavior change messaging. And so that gets to the second part of what we do, mobilization. We will canvass, we will call, we will mail, we will send digital ads, we will send messages to all of these individualized or individually identified environmentalists with messaging that is geared towards just one thing, and that is getting them to vote. And because we can bypass all that messy, sticky, opinion-changing, mind-changing stuff, this also frees us up to be completely agnostic and test hundreds of different messages each year, figuring out which messages work best with which subgroups of non-voting environmentalists to turn them into better, more consistent voters. And we run hundreds of randomized control trials. And you can go to our results page on our website and see a lot of those randomized control trials and tests that we run. We run them not just to see whether we're having an impact, but to see which messages work best with which subgroups. And then the final thing is habit reinforcement. We are not focused on winning one-off elections. There are a lot of great groups that already do that work and do it well. Instead, what we are focused on is getting more permanent political power for the environmental movement. And the way to do that is not to parachute into random elections this year and that year and another year, and just hope that you collectively win enough elections that maybe you'll elect some good people and they'll do the right thing. No. We care about building so much voter power that politicians become scared to death. Politicians will be forced to lead on environmental policy and climate policy because they start seeing, oh my God, where did all these environmental voters come from? And in order to do that, what we do is we go into states with lots of non-voting environmentalists, and whenever there's an election, local, state, or federal, we use it as an opportunity to improve people's voting habits. And we truly work year-round. We were active in almost 400 elections last year, an odd year when most groups were taking time off. All right, very, very quickly, we operate in 17 states. We have already started working this year. We've already contacted close to 100,000 voters in what I think is probably 30, maybe getting close to 40 different elections. This year, it's only what, like 6-7 weeks into the year? And yeah, we've already been active in that many elections. Not because all of them are important for environmental policy making. They're not. Some of them are objectively unimportant for environmental policy making. But they're all important if you're trying to change people's voting behavior, if you're trying to change them into habitual voters. And that's why we're working year-round in all these elections in these 17 states. If you would like more information about the work that we do at the Environmental Voter Project, again, please forgive me. This session is not meant to be a general introduction. It's meant to be a briefing on this voter file analysis we've done. You can go to this link on our About page on our website and learn a little bit more. Very, very quickly, our results, and then we'll get to the briefing. Just through the end of 2020, and we are about to update this chart that you're seeing. We need about 3 or 4 more weeks to get all of the voter file data in from 2021. But just through the end of 2020, we had contacted 7.4 million different individual environmentalists. Of those 7.4 million, 730,000 of them had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and their most recent local election. They had become super voters. They had become such consistent voters that if you were running for a library trustee, you would look at the voter file and say, oh my gosh, we got to reach out to this person. Those are the people that truly drive policymaking. Moreover, just last year in 2021, and this is incomplete data, you'll see the results are January to June. We are about to update this because we're getting the last few updated voter files from the end of last year. But just last year, we were active in 381 different elections, contacting almost 3.8 million different voters. And in randomized control trials, which very briefly just mean in experiments that are meant to control for all outside variables and just narrow in, just focus on what our individual impact on turnout was, we were solely responsible for boosting turnout 0.9 percentage points over our control group in those 2 Georgia US Senate runoff elections. Now, to be clear, we obviously weren't contacting every single voter in Georgia. We were only contacting the unlikely to vote environmentalists. But in that instance, that was over 340,000 people. That's a big, big boost. And you'll see, we had similar results, oftentimes even better, in San Antonio, New York City, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and that's just the first half of last year. This is the power of the type of work that we do, individually identifying these voters who are already with us. They don't need opinion-changing messaging. They just need cutting-edge behavioral interventions to try to turn them into better voters. And these are the results that we're getting, and we're getting them thanks to a lot of you. Many of you are volunteers, many of you are donors. Thank you for this. And again, know that we're going to have the results for the second half of last year. We'll be releasing them hopefully in about 3 or 4 weeks, as well as our annual impact report for last year. We just need to wait for the last few states to release updated voter files. If you want more information on our results, you can go to environmentalvoter.org/results. All right, that's it. Enough about us. Let's jump into this voter file data. All right, first some definitions. When we talk about environmental drop-off voters, this is what we mean. First, when we say environmental, we mean these people we've identified in these predictive models I mentioned. And in particular, these are people who have at least a 75% likelihood of not just caring about climate or the environment, but literally listing it as their #1 most important issue priority over all others. All right, what do we mean by drop-off? These are voters who are registered. They are registered to vote, and they voted in the 2020 presidential general or primary. But they haven't voted in any other election since 2016. So why are we focusing on these people in particular? Because at the Environmental Voter Project, we actually target many more people than this. We target all environmentalists who are unlikely to vote. But these drop-off voters are particularly important because they at least have some recent experience voting. Yes, it was in a much more salient, much more high turnout election, but lots of organizations, rightly so, and many campaigns view these drop-off voters as the most gettable turnout targets. These are the people who, if you're trying to expand that denominator of who shows up and casts a ballot this fall in the midterm elections, these are the people who you're most likely to be able to pull off the sidelines. So that's why today we're focusing in on these environmental drop-off voters. The 8 states we're going to be focused on are the 8 states you see in green. Again, to be clear, if you remember that previous map I showed you, we at the Environmental Voter Project are active in 17 states. We're also active in those light yellow states that you see. But today, we're just going to talk about the 8 states in dark green because I get it. Everybody's got midterms on the mind, and these are 8 very, very important midterm battleground states. Does that mean the other states are unimportant? No. New Mexico's probably going to have 3 tight congressional races. Iowa might have 2 or 3. Maine's going to have a tight gubernatorial. New York, gosh, they might have like 5 or 6 tight congressional races. A lot of these states are going to be very important. But today we're focused on these 8. And then finally, just as a reminder, these are not all of the voters that we target at the Environmental Voter Project. These are about 1/3 of the voters. There are other unlikely voters who we target. We're not going to talk about them today. They are these other infrequent voters that you see. And just in these 8 states, when you put them all together, there are 2.9 million of these low propensity environmental voters. These are environmentalists we've identified who are unlikely to vote this year. But today, we're just going to talk about these 963,000 environmental drop-off voters. And yeah, there are that many, almost 1 million in those 8 states that I mentioned. So let's dive into the data. And boy, am I going to throw a lot of data at you guys today. I know that's why you're here. We're the data nerds of the environmental movement. You're at the right place. Oh gosh, I forgot. I need a little bit more data and terminology. I'll go really, really quickly through this. Voter files do not provide gender data. They provide sex data. Obviously, sex and gender are not analogous. And so rather than try to assume that everybody was labeled with a particular sex in voter files is that gender, just understand this is why we are going to talk about this as sex rather than gender. Similarly, we are going to use the identifying racial nomenclature that is in voter files. Otherwise, we might mislead you and present the data in a weird way because Black and African American aren't completely analogous. Hispanic and Latinx aren't completely analogous. Who uses the term Caucasian anymore? I mean, there's lots of like weird things about voter file race data. Just understand this is why we're using these terms. A lot of the stuff that we have become used to using is not completely analogous to what's in the voter file. Also, finally, please understand that there is some incomplete data in the voter file, and I'm going to call that out in each state. All right, let's start with Arizona, okay? We have identified 101,334 of these environmental drop-off voters in the battleground state of Arizona. As a reminder, that means they are registered to vote. They have a very high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their top priority. They voted in the 2020 presidential, but haven't voted in any other election going all the way back to 2016. If you look at this map is going to be similar to the other 7 maps that I show you today, in that the jurisdictions that are colored in are state representative, or in some states they're called state assembly districts. So the smallest state legislative body, that's what we've used. Another important thing to understand is the darker parts of the map versus the lighter parts of the map are not measuring pure population density, pure numbers of people. That's kind of misleading. If we did that, then every map we showed you would just kind of show you where all the people live, which isn't that useful. What these maps instead show is where are there the highest concentrations of environmental drop-off voters as a percentage of all voters in that area. And we like presenting that. First of all, it's just much more useful. And 2, because it shows you not where lots of people live, and not even necessarily where lots of environmental drop-off voters live, but more importantly, where environmental drop-off voters can have the most impact, where they have the most political power, because they make up the largest percentage of the overall electorate in that area. Okay, looking at some of the demographic data back there, this is one of those instances where we have incomplete data about the voter's sex. You'll see there's lots of unknown. There are very high unknown numbers in the voter sex data here. That's because Arizona doesn't release a lot of that data, and so it has to be commercially sourced. But you'll see in Arizona, oh my gosh, is this a really young population? Almost 46% of these environmental drop-off voters are 18 to 24. You'll also see something that you're going to see in almost every slide I show you from here on out, and that is that this population of environmental drop-off voters is disproportionately Hispanic and Asian American and Pacific Islander. That is something that is a strain throughout all of these slides, and you begin to see it here. Another thing that you'll start to see a little bit, this map of Arizona actually shows a surprisingly suburban, exurban, and even rural population. Usually we're used to seeing our targets be in a really dense urban cluster. That's not as much the case in Arizona. All right, Florida, 259,000 of these environmental drop-off voters. That is a big number in Florida, a big number. 4 years ago in the Florida midterms, The Senate race was decided by 10,000 votes. The gubernatorial race was decided by 32,000 votes. That is a big number in Florida. Another thing that we see in Florida is a huge, I mean, I'll call it a gender gap because that's a term of art, but again, remember, we're talking about sex data, not gender data. But a big gender gap. Women are significantly more represented in this group of environmental drop-off voters than men. And by the way, that has nothing to do with voting behavior. It has everything to do with the fact that women are always more likely to care deeply about environmental issues than men are. We see that throughout our data in all 17 of our states. What we also see is you'll see a lot of clustering around cities, and in particular around Orlando. What we're seeing there is actually that's where a huge number of our Hispanic targets are. They're not as much the Cubanos who are in the Miami area, but rather the Puerto Ricans who are living in the Orlando area. All right, Georgia. Here's an example of a dense urban cluster. This is more like what we often see in a lot of our other states. 63,842 of these environmental drop-off voters in Georgia. Again, bigger than the margin of victory for governor in 2018, 5 times bigger than the margin of victory for president 2 years ago. In Georgia, we continue to see, I mean, this is one of the states where it's really stark, this huge overrepresentation of Hispanics and AAPI voters. I mean, you look at that data, Hispanic voters are 3 times as prevalent among these environmental drop-off voters as they are in the overall universe of registered voters in Florida. And it's even more than that among Asian American and Pacific Islander voters in Georgia. Really stark. And by the way, I should mention, we're not the only organization that's seeing this in our research. Tony Leiserowitz at a Yale program on climate change communications, they are seeing a lot of Hispanic and AAPI voters caring deeply about climate and the environment, and Pew Research is picking that up as well. All right, Nevada. Those of you who have heard interviews with me or maybe been on a previous webinar, you know that Nevada is one of the 2 states I'm obsessed with in these midterms. Why? Competitive gubernatorial, competitive US Senate, competitive state Senate. 3 out of their 4 congressional seats are probably going to be competitive. And it's a small state. I mean, like, not even 1 million people voted last time there was a midterm. And so the fact that there are 56,000 of these super environmentalists who voted in the presidential but don't normally vote in midterms, I mean, that is an enormous pool of potential political power in an enormously important political state. These environmental drop-off voters can make a big difference in Nevada. An interesting thing to see here is, yes, there's obviously a lot of urban clustering, but it's just as much around Carson City and Reno, up there in that like little elbow of the state, as it is down in the southern part of the state in Las Vegas. Please also note that similar to Arizona, the data on voter sex is missing a lot. We're missing a lot of it. So don't read too much into that. There's a lot of that unknown in there. All right, New Hampshire. Yes, there's urban clustering here, but this is a far more exurban and rural, well, suburban, exurban, and rural population than we're used to seeing. Here, boy, is a lot of data missing. As I'm sure comes as no surprise to people, New Hampshire, live free or die. They don't really want to share all of this voter file data in the way that a lot of other states do. And so you'll notice that we're missing a lot of data on voter age here, which is odd, but it just is what it is. But we do have a pretty complete set of voter sex data. And here, once again, you see that enormous gender gap, that huge gender gap. All right, North Carolina, 152,539 of these environmental drop-off voters. Lots of urban clustering, huge overrepresentation of Hispanics and AAPI voters. Maybe you've seen in some previous states, in all of these states, white voters are underrepresented among these environmental drop-off voters. And to a lesser extent, Black voters are underrepresented. Now, a thing to bear in mind is we don't see that underrepresentation of Black voters if we back up a little bit, and instead of just looking at drop-off voters, looking at all of the low propensity environmental voters that we're targeting. But still, it's worth calling out. It's worth calling out. But here, once again, see really dramatic overrepresentation of Hispanic and Asian Americans. Also, check out that northwestern corner of North Carolina. That is around Appalachian State University. And oh my gosh, are there a huge, huge number of these environmental drop-off voters there. I would go so far as to say there are tens of thousands of environmentalists who are registered to vote in and around Appalachian State University who've clearly voted for the first time in the previous presidential election and like have never voted in anything else before or after. And that is a huge opportunity. I know there are a lot of other organizations that are on this webinar right now, and this is important data that I think can be actionable to a lot of people. We don't yet have congressional maps finalized in North Carolina, but we do know that there's an open and what will likely be extraordinarily competitive US Senate race. All right, here's the second of these two states that I'm completely obsessed with, Pennsylvania, and not just because I was born in Pennsylvania and grew up there, but because it's enormously important. The state legislature, the state Senate there is pretty tight, but the US Senate and governor's races are completely open. Boy, are they going to be competitive. And there is a huge, huge number of these environmental drop-off voters. Moreover, boy, did this data really surprise me. How did it surprise me? Well, first, these environmental drop-off voters are always young. I don't think that surprises anybody. But in Arizona and especially in Pennsylvania, oh my gosh, are they young? I mean, look, almost 50% of them are between the ages of 18 to 24. And then another 40% are between 25 and 34. Another interesting thing here is we don't see that an overrepresentation of Hispanic voters in Pennsylvania. There's actually a fairly significant Hispanic population in Pennsylvania around Philadelphia, but also around the Allentown area and Lehigh County, but we're not seeing them pop here. This is actually a much whiter population than we see in a lot of states. Obviously, there's that huge overrepresentation of AAPI voters again. But in addition to this being a slightly whiter population, one thing that totally blew my mind, and anybody who's familiar with Pennsylvania politics is probably looking a little cockeyed at this map right now. This is a really ex-urban and rural population. Yeah, you see that big dark thing in the middle, that's around Penn State's main campus. You see some clustering around Pittsburgh. You see a lot of clustering in the close Philadelphia suburbs, but you also see really, really dense populations going up the eastern edge of the state and going along the southern part of the state into Lancaster and Berks and Bucks and Pike and Monroe counties, these places that like you're not used to hearing on election night, like while watching CNN or MSNBC, and they actually are not like big progressive hubs. But boy, are there a lot of rural 18 to 24-year-olds who care deeply about the environment in Pennsylvania, but they just hardly ever vote. And this is a really interesting, unexpected finding for us, because it also speaks to the importance of individualized targeting in Pennsylvania. You're not just going to be able to go to a few big college campuses and get all your targets out. They're in much more dispersed ex-urban and rural areas. Finally, Texas. We're back to a lot of the really, really dense urban clustering that we saw in Georgia. 117,923 of these environmental drop-off voters in Texas. Yes, they skew young. We still see significant overrepresentation of Asian Americans, much less so among Hispanic voters. Another thing that I think is very interesting to point out in Texas, there are huge numbers of low propensity environmental voters in Texas, but they're not drop-off voters. If you look at this drop-off voter number, I got to tell you that in and of itself, even though it's a big raw number, when you put it over a Texas-sized denominator, it's actually not much. 117,000, yeah, like that can be a lot in elections. In Texas, it's usually not a lot. If the environmental movement wants to make hay with turnout in Texas, they're going to have to go beyond just the environmental drop-off voters and get the people who are either less likely voters, or some of the people we're targeting at EVP who aren't technically drop-off voters. That's not because they're even more infrequent voters. It could mean that they just came of age and were just able to register to vote, so they don't have a voting history. It could mean they just became a citizen. It could mean they just moved into the state, and so they don't have a state-based voting history. And it turns out there are tons of them. I'm going to look at my notes here so don't get it wrong. We identified 634,019 of those other low propensity environmental voters in Texas. So that's additional to that 117,000. But just these drop-off voters, the ones who are traditionally easier to pull off the sidelines, there aren't as many of them in Texas. All right, those were the 8 states. What I want to finish with before we get to the Q&A is, if you are interested in helping us talk to these people, boy, would we love your help. We need volunteers and we need money. And I am not ashamed to ask for either, because we have the receipts to prove that we are good at finding these low propensity environmental voters and turning them into voters. We've run hundreds of randomized control trials now showing that while controlling for all outside variables, we can find these people and turn them into voters. So if you would like to volunteer, we have phone banks 2 or 3 times a week. You can easily get trained online. And when you do that, you can even call by yourself. You could sit in a chair or sit down in the basement on your couch while watching TV and call these voters. You don't need to, you're not pushing for a particular candidate. We're nonpartisan. We supply you with a script that we know from previous experiments is optimized to get these people to vote. There will be a link in the chat where you can just go and sign up for a training. The beginning of every phone bank starts with a training. 2, you can send postcards to these voters. We will supply you with the postcards. We have tested this design. We know it works. We've tested the language. We know it works. If you want to supply your own stamps, awesome. If you don't, that's fine too. We'll send you the stamps. We just finished 2 big postcarding campaigns, the Tempe, Arizona and Orlando, Florida. They have elections coming up on March 8th, but we've already gotten all the postcards out the door because early voting has just started. In about 10 to 14 days, we are going to be announcing our next postcarding campaign. As I think all of you know, we always like to be really transparent with our volunteers and our donors about what we're thinking. The reason we can't announce this next postcarding campaign now is because we thought we were going to do it around the Georgia primary, and a federal judge has put a hold on collecting signatures while that judge reviews the congressional map that was drawn. So we don't know yet if that primary is going to be postponed. If it is postponed, we might have a different campaign for postcards. But very soon, we will be sending you information, letting you know, hey, you can sign up for the postcarding campaign. And then finally, door-to-door canvassing. If you live in any of our 17 states, or if you want to travel to any of our 17 states, door-to-door canvassing is still the single most effective way to turn non-voters into voters. We'll give you scripts, we will give you the materials, and you can get to work. We would also love your financial support. The secret sauce to us getting such great results is not, unfortunately, because we're really smart and we use cutting edge messaging. I like to think that we're pretty smart and we do use cutting edge messaging, but the truth is, the reason we get such great results is because we're stubborn rather than smart. It's because we work year round. It's because we realize that if you're trying to create habitual voters, you need to talk to them whenever they have an election. So why am I bringing this up now? This is why monthly donations are so important. If you are able to support us even just a little bit regularly each month, boy, does that help us talk to voters early when it's so much more efficient to start improving their voting habits. Obviously, we would love one-time donations as well. And then finally, if you're interested in hosting a Zoom fundraiser, please, please, please let us know. You can reply to any of the emails that you got notifying you about this event, or you can email info@environmentalvoter.org, and we would love to chat with you about discussing the Environmental Voter Project on Zoom with a bunch of your friends. And if after hearing that, they want to support us, awesome. All right, that is it. We are through the presentation, through the briefing, and now I am really, really excited to hear your questions. I know that Shannon and Ren have probably been answering a lot of your questions in the Q&A. Please try to remember to put them in the Q&A. And with that, Shannon, what you got? Any?
Yes, I've got a bit of a two-part question for you, Nathaniel, to start things off. One, how the heck did we choose this group of 17 states? And are we thinking about adding more to the docket?
Really, really great question. Okay, so let me actually answer this question by, once again, quickly just sharing my screen so that those of you who have forgotten what states that we're in, you can see them. So these are the 17 states that we're in. Why did we choose these states? One, each of these 17 states have huge, disproportionately large populations of non-voting environmentalists. That's really important to us because no matter how good we are, we're not going to impact policymaking if there aren't that many targets for us in a particular state. So like, you know, if there are only 15 non-voting environmentalists in Delaware, well, who cares if we turn them all into consistent voters? That's not going to change anything. So the first thing we look for is a big fat denominator where there are lots of non-voting environmentalists. And you'll notice there are a lot of important states where we're not working, like say Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota. And I would never claim that Wisconsin is a politically unimportant state. Oh my God, is it important? But it's very important to us to be able to tell our volunteers and our donors that their time and their financial support goes a long way with us. And we can't necessarily say that, at least not to the same extent as in other states, in places like Wisconsin or Michigan or Minnesota. Why? Because there aren't that many non-voting environmentalists there. So that's the first criteria we use. Second, we pick states where they have active election calendars. Remember what I said earlier? One of the secret sauces to how we're able to get these results is that we work year-round in all different types of elections. Well, oddly enough, some states just have more elections than other states. For instance, Oregon, for good government reasons, has pretty much put every single one of their elections in even years. So municipal elections, county elections, everything happens in even years for good reason, right? Like there's good public policy reason for that. They think, oh, well, we can get a lot more people to vote for their municipal leaders if we just have it coincide with like a presidential election. That's not good for us. That means we only get to talk to people in states like that twice every 2 years. And if you're trying to change habits, parachuting in and talking to people once or twice every 2 years ain't enough. Whereas in a place like Georgia, where they have odd year elections, even year elections, primaries, then primaries go to runoffs, then generals go to runoffs, then specials, and specials go to runoffs. I mean, we could talk to some of our targets in Georgia 8, 9, 10 times a year. And then finally, the third criteria we choose is we don't care just about impacting federal policymaking. We also care about impacting state and local policymaking. So yeah, you'll notice there are a lot of purple states among these 17, but they're not all purple. There are some red states, Alaska, Kansas, There's some blue states, Massachusetts. We're there because it's not just about changing federal policymaking, it's also about changing state and local policymaking. So those are the three criteria we use. Yes, we will eventually be expanding into additional states, I hope, but not this year. These 17 states are a lot. We know that we can accomplish a lot in these 17 states. And yeah, maybe next year we'll look at expanding into additional ones, but for this year, this is what we're looking at.
Awesome. This is another potential two-parter, but only because I feel like if I only ask you one of them, you might get at some of the second one as well. So we've had a few questions about all of the different basically voter suppression and voter misinformation policies and campaigns that are running in the world right now. So part one is, how is EVP handling some of that? And how can volunteers help us do that? And then expanding from there a little bit, we also had a question about broader justice, equity, diversity issues at EVP and how we are addressing them.
Really, really great questions. Thank you. Thank you for asking them. So I'll take the first part of the question first. Yes, voter suppression is not just awful and anti-democratic and dangerous on its own. It is particularly bad for the environmental movement. Obviously, this briefing that we just gave zeroed in on a really small subpopulation of environmentalists, that is, these drop-off voters. But as you even saw in that subpopulation, they are much more likely to be young, they are much more likely to be people of color, and what was not in that data, but what I can tell you is these environmentalists are also much more likely to make less than $50,000 a year than more. Now, obviously, there's a whole lot of nuance and we're doing individualized targeting. But what I can tell you is everything that I just said about those demographic groups doesn't just hold true for these drop-off voters. It holds true for all low propensity environmental voters and all environmentalists writ large. Now, obviously, all environmentalists aren't people of color, poor people, young people, but they are disproportionately that, at least currently in the United States of America. And so why am I mentioning those three groups over and over again? Because people of color, young people, poorer people are always, always the object of voter suppression laws. If any local, state, or federal government is trying to make it harder for someone to vote, I guarantee you they are targeting one of those three groups: young people, poor people, or people of color. And that is the beating heart of the modern American environmental movement. And so whether the people enacting these voter suppression laws know it or not, they are disproportionately bleeding the power from the environmental movement. And so ballot access is extraordinarily important to the environmental movement. How can the work that we do at the Environmental Voter Project help address this? Well, first, I just want to be clear, we like to do what we do well and leave other organizations to do what they do well. We are not a litigation shop. We are not a legislative advocacy shop. There are other great organizations that do that stuff. But what we are really good at is finding cutting edge, impactful ways to talk to people who are very unlikely to vote and help them vote. And so what we're doing with our little bit of how to address voter suppression is contact people who are about to get purged and let them know, hey, there's a postcard coming to your house and you need to fill it out and reply to it or you're going to get purged from voter rolls. Or even if they're not purged, we're contacting people to let them know how early voting has changed in their state, how mail voting has changed in their state, what they might have to bring with them when they vote. You don't need me to tell you that there is this like incredibly convoluted 50-state patchwork around the rules and laws around voting, and it's changing all the time. Even someone who lives this stuff gets confused about what the laws are and what the rules are in various states now. And so a lot of what we're doing is around the basic logistics of this is how you vote, and using all of these resources, mail, digital, calls, canvassing, to make sure that these voters know how that they can vote. Very quickly, the second part of that question, what are we doing at EVP to address a lot of these climate and environmental and racial justice issues? Well, again, we like to do what we think we can do well and not necessarily do what other groups do well. We are not a grassroots organizing organization, and we are not a sort of traditional environmental justice organization. But what we can do and what we take very seriously is, one, we know that we have all of this data, and we'd love to give briefings and trainings publicly and privately to organizations to help them understand the changing face of the environmental movement and the changing face of voter suppression, where they live, so that they can try to overcome these injustice issues. The second thing is we reach out to a lot of organizations to try to figure out, is there some of this data information that we can supply to you? So where you are in your county, can we create a map for you? Like, we can't actually give them the names for legal reasons, but can we create a map for you? Can we tell you where all of these voters of a specific gender or specific race or a specific income bracket, where they are, who they are, and what they care about, so that we can arm you with what it takes to fight a lot of these systemic injustices? And then third, just internally as an organization, we try to be brutally honest with ourselves and recognize that this is something that every organization needs to get smarter about and get better about. We have regular bi-weekly meetings about how we're going to be thoughtfully and deliberately anti-racist with everything that we do. But I don't want to pat ourselves on the back and claim that, like, we're doing a great job. I feel like everybody's doing a pretty awful job on this stuff. But I'm confident that we're consistently trying to get better.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Next question, that's probably not to your surprise, we've had a few times, is folks wondering why we didn't mention texting as one of our volunteer options for this year.
Yes, so thank you, whoever asked that. I know it remains on a lot of people's minds. Forgive me if there are those of you who have received the information that I'm about to impart either by text or in a previous webinar, but I do think it's important. It's important to remind people of what's going on, because I understand people love texting and we'd love to have you text with us. So very, very briefly, this is what's going on. Back in October, all the mobile phone carriers got together and enacted a set of rules that they called 10 DLC restrictions. It's not important what 10 DLC means. These restrictions prohibit sending text messages to voters unless those voters have opted into receiving text messages from that specific sender. And obviously, that eliminates the ability to do any impactful voter turnout campaigns by text message. They've said they'll enforce these rules with audits, with fines, and that they'll dramatically restrict the number of texts that actually get delivered after volunteers send them. All right, now many of you are saying, okay, Nathaniel, but how come like these other organizations are still texting? Well, this is what's going on. First, there are commercial apps, commercial texting apps. So the one that we use is Hustle. What Hustle has done is they've literally made it impossible now for us to continue texting unless we lie. I know it sounds dramatic, but it's just factually accurate. They now require us and anybody who uses commercial app texting app services, before we text a single voter, to promise to check a box saying that every single person we text, we have individually gotten them to opt in to receiving texts. And that's something we can't do. And we don't feel comfortable lying. And so obviously setting EVP up for additional liability. Like, I know what these companies are trying to do. They're trying to say, oh, if we get in trouble, like, don't worry, they told us that they made a promise. That's not fair to our donors to have their money going towards us paying fines. And it's not fair to our volunteers. Now, some organizations have continued to use these commercial apps, and they're not doing it because they're being dishonest or sneaky. They doubt that the fines will be enforced, or they're not worried that some of their texts aren't being delivered. But we feel it's very important to be able to look our volunteers and our donors in the eyes and assure them that their efforts and their investments are having an impact. And I should add, we're getting regular reports that texts are not being consistently delivered after volunteers send them. And oh my gosh, do we not want to train volunteers, ask you to do something, assure you that it's being impactful, and then realize that actually all that time you spent wasn't going through. So that's something that we take very, very seriously.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel, for going into that. And I'll just add an extra caveat there that if anyone does like want to have a separate conversation, you have a lot more questions about the specifics here, you're welcome to reach out to Ren or I on the organizing team, because we know way too much about some of the ins and outs of this. So I'll just say that again, folks can always ask us questions there as well. Circling back to some of the stuff that came up actually in the early part of the presentation, Nathaniel, we had a few questions from folks about how do we know these people are environmentalists? Are we guessing? Are they telling us? Could you talk about some of that data and where we get it?
Yeah, so really, really great question. And boy, could I give you the 15-minute version of this, but we only have 6 minutes left, and we want to have a close and we want to respect people's time. So please forgive me for only giving the 2-minute version of it. But I can say that if you go to our YouTube page, you can see a lot of presentations on how we do this. But very, very briefly, what we do is we survey tens of thousands of people by phone, online panel, text message, maybe even some direct mail, I think. Simply asking them what their number one most important political priorities are. Then we work with data scientists to isolate the people who reply to that survey saying climate change, environmental justice, clean air, clean water, some environmental issue is their top priority. Now, what that is just like a few thousand people, right? But what we're able to do working with data scientists is figure out, okay, what do we know about these 1,000 people? What do we know about these people who just told us that not only do they care deeply about climate and the environment, it is quite literally their number one most important priority. And what those data scientists do is they look at voter file data, they look at census data, they look at publicly available behavioral data and consumer data. We only use publicly available data. We use the same data that the Democrats use and that various campaigns use and nonprofits and things like that. But there's a lot of it out there. And what that allows these data scientists to do is build what's called a predictive model, which is kind of what it sounds like. It's a model that helps you predict how likely everybody is in a state to think X or to think Y. In this particular instance, what we're trying to do is extrapolate out from those few thousand people in, say, Florida, who told us that climate's their number one priority, and identify other people like them. And it's a long iterative process, but at the end of it, what we are able to do is assign a score from 0 to 100 to every individual voter in Florida's state voter file or any state voter file, telling us how likely they are to list climate or the environment as their top priority. So, does this mean when I say we've identified 120,000 environmental drop-off voters in Nevada that we have spoken to every single one of those 120,000 people? No, no. Just like a pollster who calls 600 people hasn't spoken to all 3 million people in that state. But what we have done is spoken to thousands of people in that state, learned a lot about them, and then extrapolated from that and built a predictive model and then tested it and tested it and tested it and called more voters and more voters until we have a really, really precise set of scores telling us this group of people right here, these are the super environmentalists. And just to put a button on it, what I can tell you is This is how presidential campaigns now target voters. It's how Senate campaigns now target voters. It's how gubernatorial campaigns now target voters. They have assigned individualized scores to individual voters. No one targets by demographic group anymore. No one's going after soccer moms or NASCAR dads or this or that or the other thing. No, they're going after Betsy Smith at 123 Main Street because they have a predictive modeling score that says she has an 82.1% likelihood of voting, but she hasn't made up her mind yet. And I know that sounds a little creepy. I get it. But as long as you're using publicly available, ethically sourced data, you better believe we're going to use it. Because what we have not spoken about today in this webinar is the climate crisis and the democracy crisis and everything that we are dealing with in our political world right now. And we live in a moment in time where we have the legislative answers. We have the policy solutions to solve so many of these problems. And the only thing we are missing is political power. And so if we have the ability to individually identify who these super environmentalists are, who are already with us and they're just not voting, and then deliver optimized behavioral science informed messaging to them in order to turn them into voters, yeah, you better believe we're going to do that. You better believe we're going to do that. All right. We told you many, many times that we are not going to keep you late. It is 7:58 here on the East Coast. I know it's 4:58 on the West Coast and in between in Central and Mountain. Thank you for spending time with us. I'm just going to finish with one final sort of minute send-off, and that is this. Please, please, please take a moment. The link is in the chat. Sign up to volunteer. Sign up to make calls. Sign up to knock on doors. Sign up to send postcards. We have less than 9 months until these midterms come. And I know, I almost don't want to say it. I don't want to make you feel guilty, but like I know how I would feel. Don't have any regrets. I know you don't want to sit down on your couch and watch election returns come in November and think like, oh gosh, I should have done more. I should have started sooner. We are waiting for you. If you go to our website, sign up to volunteer, we have a team of people waiting for that notification to come to us and saying, how can we help them talk to these non-voting environmentalists? Second thing, please make a donation. We know how to find these people. We know what messaging to deliver to them. We can scale up by typing an extra 0 on my keyboard and hitting return. It's that easy to scale up. All we need is more volunteers and more money. And yeah, I am not ashamed or afraid to ask for more money. I know that what we are doing works. I know that you care about this or you wouldn't be here. And I know I'm asking you to do something when you're tired. We're in the middle of the climate crisis. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We're in the middle of a democracy crisis. I know it's hard, but I also know you care about this stuff. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for learning about some of our findings. Please reach out to us if you have additional questions. I know that Shannon and Ren have been doing extraordinary work answering all your questions, but I also know we probably didn't get to all of them. And so we will be sending out a recording sometime tomorrow, but also feel free to respond to any of the emails that we've sent you with any questions. And thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight.